Alright, video making. Yay, I did the button. Yeah. Still a little cold here. Anyway. Where was I? Yeah, I'm starting the video. That's it. Starting the video. Sunday video. Something like this. See, I haven't been aiming very well lately. Whole nother issue. Anyway, whatever. Video. Guilt and shame. Yes, Inmendham is basically arguing that somehow we're trying to guilt or shame people into being vegetarians, and that's coercion. That guilt and shame are coercion. Yeah, it doesn't fit in my head, just because guilt and shame only work if you have some internal mechanism that's basically saying there's something you can guilt or shame me about. So you have to sort of believe you're guilty of something, right? So it's like when religious nuts would say, try to guilt or shame a kid out of masturbating or something. Yeah, of course it didn't work, right? Because they don't feel any need to be guilty or ashamed. It's not going to work. It'll have no effect. So without the sense of conscience, without a sense of, trespass, wrongness, there's no effect to guilt or shame. So you have to know there's a problem for guilt or shame to work. And in most of this argumentation, I think, is with people who don't really want to acknowledge the existence of the problem. They have rationalized their way out of the problem. And so it's just not the weapon being used. The weapon is an attempt to reason with their desire to be intellectually honest and to have some sense of integrity. And the hope is they have some guilt there, some capacity to be shamed by their ignorance, shamed by their dishonesty, the lack of integrity, and their duplicity would reveal to them that yes, this is a problem. They do have to deal with it. They have to do better than I feel like it, or whatever their excuse is. Their rationalization, animals don't feel, animals aren't real, animals are made out of moon cheese, whatever their bullshit is. And they do have bullshit. I mean, preposterous bullshit. They start talking about plants, like a plant is, geranium is the same thing as a pig, Crazy crap like that pops out, and you're just like, whoa. What are you going to do with that, right? But yeah, this mechanism of guilt, there's a whole thread of comments between Conference Report and Inmendham on his last video, so I'll post a link to that, the comment page. Interesting reading. But yeah, it's this crazy idea that somehow our behavior, you can't become informed of something without experiencing a sense of guilt, right? I mean, if you learn after you've been doing something for a while that it's wrong, you're going to feel guilty for your past crimes. But it's not guilt that made you change your behavior. What made you change your behavior was a realization that the behavior was wrong and you didn't want to be an asshole. So, guilt is always going to be associated with any kind of enlightenment, because it's likely you have been unenlightened before you became enlightened, and therefore will have to endure some measure of guilt for past performance. You really can't impose guilt for a future event. I mean, you can only get people to be uncertain of their the strength of their position, and hopefully weed them down. But yeah, they're going to endure a sense of guilt if they change, but that guilt isn't what changed them. So that's what we're really arguing with here. And so his implication is is that you have to make people, that people have to be more genuine in their behavior. They can't be coerced into behaving. And so that's another point where that just goes, that you can't do that as an absolute. Because we're all cheaters, I think. We all, even the best intended person, it's really hard. Hey, pup. How you doing? Even the best intended person is going to cross the line. Convenient rationalizations, the crowd's applauding because they made a funny joke and they accidentally made the joke. They're not going to sit there and admit, wait a minute, it wasn't a joke, I just said the wrong word. They'll just take it and receive credit for something they didn't do. So, I mean, these are little examples, but you know what I mean. There's all kinds of examples where you'll take advantage of a circumstance that's, you're not going to get caught taking advantage. And getting caught is a big part of this whole thing. But, we're the animal that we are is not really a very pleasant beast. So let's not pretend we can be our native selves and we don't need any reforming or obliging law to keep us in line. Ideally we don't. There's a big horse shit in the middle of my path. Ideally we shouldn't need it. For the gross crimes, many of us don't need it. There's no point in having that as a maxim or an axiom or any kind of So what was the point of this? So really the whole point is we're getting to is what changes behavior, and there's probably two components, right? There's this aggressive teaching adults kind of work, and then there's the effect of that, which is the next generation is taught a better way of life. So, abolishing slavery wasn't just about getting the current people to understand it was wrong. It was also about the fact that through those conversations, through a migration of the memes, it became something that it became the norm rather than the abnorm, to perceive it as a crime and invalid and wrong. It's a lot easier when when you don't have the garbage in, you don't have to do the extraction of the garbage. So so over time it becomes where you don't have to make this argument anymore. You don't have to argue against slavery anymore because people are smarter and they understand the dynamic of human evolution in a broader context, and they don't buy the bullshit anymore. Same with the whole women's rights thing. So old ideas died, but they first have to die in a current generation, and then they're not instilled in the next generation. So it's kind of like racism. Theoretically, it's going to have a lot less of a life the fewer racists you raise. It is that simple in a lot of ways. And certainly with vegetarianism, it's probably the same kind of idea. If you don't raise children with this duplicity of treatment and some understanding that animals aren't here to be at your to be used. They're not dish towels, and they're not wagon wheels, and they're not things. They are creatures, the sentient ones of respectable dignity and welfare, and you just don't screw with that. You don't cause unnecessary harm. Seems really simple, like this one really should be over. Really shouldn't have to do this one, but we do. And so the first argument you got to make is to the existing people with their existing prejudice, claiming a superiority and we're magnificent and they're not. We, cheat on our wives and they can't. Therefore, we can harm them and torture them and kill them. Yeah, well, come on. That doesn't really work. But anyway, the argument has to be made. And that's what people are doing. They're making an argument. You can't really make people feel guilty until they can recognize the truth of the circumstance. Now, whether as a society you should pass laws whether people understand or not, I'd say, yeah, lots of good laws that a lot of people don't want to obey, but they are socially constructive, so you keep them because they help maintain our productivity. And that's just sensible, really. What else? I mean, the idea of voluntary taxation certainly wouldn't work. So you certainly have to, involuntarily extract. Because all of us are going to make excuses for why we shouldn't have the burden. Yeah. Where else do we need to go? But the idea is that you're attempting to migrate memes, ideas. You're attempting to make the idea contagious. You're not trying to just create guilt mechanisms. But the bottom line is that, you can't avoid guilt if the person has been doing something the wrong way for 30 or 40 years. Some of that's going to end up in the game. And I guess I'd also argue that it's just on its face kind of a bogus thing to call coercion, to call guilt coercion. Because guilt is completely in your own psychology. If a person can't take responsibility for their own emotional character, then that's pretty weak. That's fairly lame. And, that's no sale. This is just based on habit and conditioning. So some of this stuff, if you don't catch it early, if they don't have some mechanism of discipline, then they're unlikely to acquire, decent habits. Certainly could be argued that I have some personality defects, that it would have been probably a good thing if I had been shamed out of them earlier in my life. If the younger dog would have been taught the neater trick of being socially manipulative and playing the game by their rules, maybe I would have gotten farther in life. Would have been better for me, would have been better for my purposes, would have been better for the other people having to endure my insufferable obnoxiousness. But, I wasn't sufficiently guilted out of it, so this is the way I turned out. So again, I don't see any room here for an argument. Guilt is not coercion. It's sometimes a very useful mechanism, emotional mechanism. It's certainly within your own power to control what you're going to feel guilty about. And you're certainly can't feel guilty about something you know to be right. I don't see how that's even possible. So how could it possibly be a threat? Somebody else is going to make you feel bad for being right? I don't think that's possible. So I think the idea of coercion is just silly. And especially when somebody's arguing from a mass pop culture majoritarian position to be using guilt as an argument. And And to even say the word coercion when there is so much of this pop culture, everybody else is doing it, kind of bullshit to the opposite side of the argument. The opposite side of the argument just keeps spouting their majority status. And this is the way people are. It's the way we're always going to be. And, they're very confident because of that. So I would argue that mechanism is the more destructive argument from popularity, is more insidious and dangerous than the argument from guilt, or the argument from you should change. Yeah, the argument from you're wrong and here's why. I really can't see how the argument from you're wrong, this is why, is somehow invalid relative to the argument from everybody else is doing it. So shame on you, for trying to, make the abuses that come from your side, the anti-don't nag me with the truth side. What a pile of crap. Considering the intellectually vacant mush and drivel that pop ideals and popular values use as excuses for their inane and stupid behavior. Oh, it's the way it's always been. Oh yeah, that's a great excuse. Yeah. Everybody else is doing it. Yeah, great excuse. Anyway, till the next video presentation. Wish it was summer. That's what I wish. No point in me saying I wish it was warmer, is what I was going to say. No point in doing that. I wish I could just leap into the future. Yes. Or into the past. I wish I could just leap. Yeah. One big long leap. Okay. Now we are finished.